Welcome back to Southern Discomfort. This is my first official episode since I went radio silence a while back with the show. So I am glad to be back doing this. Now, for those of you who have watched in the past, Southern Discomfort was mainly focused on paranormal stuff and horror stuff. And then we had another show, started off as Sunday Shots, and then evolved into Immortal Shadows, where we focus more on spirituality and theology. The new Southern Discomfort is going to be kind of a combination of those things. I am a very eclectic person, and I have a ton of interest, and Southern Discomfort is going to reflect that. So it's basically me inviting you, the listener, into my world. And my world consists of a lot of horror stuff, a lot of paranormal stuff. It consists of a lot of theology, a lot of discipleship, a lot of biblical studies, a lot of text criticism, historical criticism, church history. Um, I also am going to do stuff on overcoming addiction and healing from abuse. So it's going to be a lot of different topics. We're going to be doing a lot of different series. So this is just kind of a catch-all show for me to kind of do whatever I want and whatever is on my mind for any given period of time, or whatever my interest is caught up in at the moment. Now, we are going to continue to do Behind the Screams, which is strictly horror-based and going through horror movies and extracting the message and looking at it from a philosophical, psychological, and theological perspective. So tonight, to kick things off, I am starting a series called Holy Horrors. And the point of this series is to basically take a look at the Old Testament, Second Temple Judaism writings, and the New Testament, and go through some of the supernatural paranormal beings that are in these writings, because I feel like there's mass ignorance on this subject, because a lot of just what we hear in modern America culture at times is that there's just angels and demons, and there's so much more than that. And it's angels and demons, it's just kind of a broad sweeping category that isn't quite not quite, but is not honest about the material in these texts at all. And if you're a writer who likes to write any type of religious horror or religious fantasy, then you might want to listen to this, because some of this stuff you can translate over well into writings and stories. I've done it. I've used a lot of these things in my own stories, in my own writings, to make up characters, to make up worlds and different things like that. So it's going to be quite interesting. And what we're going to do is tonight, we're going to look at what is called the Divine Council. Now, those of you who might be familiar with ancient Near East literature, this might not be new to you, but a lot of people may have never heard this terminology, heard this phrasing before. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And the reason this is important is because we have to look at the ancient Near East culture to understand this idea of the Divine Council and how it is seen in especially the Old Testament. So before we jump into this world of the supernatural and paranormal from ancient Judaism and Christianity, we need to talk about something. And we have to remember that when we go to ancient texts like this, their worldview and how they saw things is totally different than the way that we see things from a 21st century Western mindset. So we have to pause, and we got to take some steps back. And we're going to take a whole lot of steps back all the way to the ancient Near East. And here's why. When we study ancient documents in ancient scripture, if we are going to understand, especially I want to bring this out to those of you who are more of a, if you're in the audience and you're listening and you're a Christian, we make this error a lot of times that the Bible was written to us here in 21st century West in America, and we read it and we read things back into the text that aren't there. We put categories on the text that aren't there. We have this very anachronistic reading of the text, and we have to remember that though the Bible was written for us, that we can extract the theological truths, what it says about God, what it says about humanity, and apply those. It was not written to us. When all of these books were written, they had a specific audience in mind, the author did, and they were writing within a cultural um, milieu, in a cultural setting. And so basically what we do, we have truth delivered in culture bound, time bound capsule. And so in order to get the full potency of this capsule, we have to go back and we have to learn to try to look at these things as best as we can through the ancient eyes of both the writer and the reader. And that's going to take some work at times. And so this is what we need to remember when we're looking at these things. And so the first thing we've got to go back and look at is this idea of the divine council in the ancient Near East. And we have to remember too, when God is writing scripture and when he's leading these people to write these things, he's accommodating to them. So he's accommodating to certain worldviews, to certain ways that they viewed things in order to get his message across. And one of those big things that we'll see in the Old Testament is this idea of the divine council. So we have to address a few things here before we jump into the divine council. Number one, we need to remember that the surrounding cultures of ancient Israel, they were all polytheistic. However, this polytheism is what a lot of scholars refer to as a nuanced polytheism. And this is something that's not talked about. And we're also going to look at how this polytheism, this nuanced polytheism, plays into the Old Testament and the idea of the divine council. So nuanced polytheism in the ancient Near East, cosmogonies, and basically that is theories of the origin of the universe. The gods are traced back to one singular deity, and this is something that's never talked about. I don't ever hear it mentioned when themes of polytheism about ancient Near East culture is brought up, or when you look at the polytheism in the Old Testament. It's never talked about, and it's unfortunate because this idea of this nuanced polytheism is actually very fascinating. So what the ancient cultures believed is that there was this one ultimate deity, but this deity was basically largely inactive. Um, Ancient Near East scholar and commentator John Walton says this about this deity. He says, this primordial, singular, divine entity is not represented in the head of the pantheon, and indeed is largely inactive. And other scholars have noted this too, and they have followed it up in talking about how this inactive deity, basically, because it is so inactive, the other deities that are birthed from it, they are the ones who become active in ruling the universe. So this means that for the ancient Near East, polytheism was a second construct. Right? They had this primordial deity that didn't do anything, and it gave birth to all of these active deities that actually did do something. And so this primordial deity is hardly ever mentioned. And the reason it's hardly ever mentioned is because we have to understand something about the ancient Near East culture in how they viewed things. Their ontology, and ontology is basically the nature of being, of the existence of something. So the ontology of the ancient Near East was one of functionality, not material. So a god who does not function or acts is basically fades into non-existence. So that's why they didn't talk too much about this primordial deity and focused on the gods that were birthed out of it, because this one was in their worldview almost non-existent because it didn't perform any type of function. Um, so polytheism, you've got all of these gods, and in the ancient Near East, the major decisions among the gods was a group affair. The divine council functioned as an assembly. And what they would do is they would get together, they would deliberate and govern all of the events of mankind. And we see this divine council in ancient Near Eastern literature, such as the Ugaritic text and in Mesopotamian text. And the assembly carried out, they had like the highest authority. And it's basically was this assembly where all the gods were represented. And it usually had this great god that was at the top, and then it had some different levels. And among these gods, you had sometimes 7 were chosen to predetermine the destinies of mankind and stuff like that. And when we get into, and that was Ugaritic and Mesopotamian. When we get into Sumerian literature, it is the deity Anu who is the head of the pantheon, while Enlil often takes kind of the the more active role in this. And in the Ugaritic text, you've got the head of the pantheon is El, and I think a lot of us are familiar with the name El. We see that name actually in the Old Testament. It was one of the names that they took from the surrounding cultures and applied to the God of the Old Testament. So you've got the head of this council, which is El, and he plays the most dominant role, while others seem to be lesser deities. And so there's numerous more examples, but you can kind of get the idea is that you had these layers, you had the council, you had these layers, and you had one or several deities that were the high ranking ones at the top, and then the other lower orders under them. So the role of the divine council in the ancient Near East was the decreeing of destinies. So they were going to decree both the destinies for the divine and the human realm, along with making decisions, coming up with solutions for things that would arise in the process of governing the world. Now, it also bears mentioning that in the ancient Near East, every aspect of what we would term the natural world, they didn't have quite the distinction that we make in our culture between the natural and the supernatural. For them, not only did the gods make the decisions about things, but all the things in the natural world were also connected to a deity. And so they were not only responsible for the decrees and working out what happened among gods and humans, but they were also in control of what happened in the cosmos. And so when we start to examine the Old Testament through ancient eyes, it begins to become very apparent that the Israelites thought in terms of the divine council. And I'm going to go through and give you some examples here in a little bit. You think about what I just said. You have these councils from the A&E, head god, then lower classes under them. And we're going to see this type of structure when we get into the Old Testament, with some slight modifications by the ancient Israelites. First, I do want to say that we talked about this polytheism. Now, biblical scholars, mostly across the board, agree that while Israel was only supposed to worship one God, that one God was Yahweh, there was belief in other gods. They believed these other gods were actually real. And so to say that um, the Israelite religion was strictly monotheistic is not correct. They worshiped one God, they were supposed to worship one God, but in their belief system, they definitely believed in other gods. These were lesser deities. None of them had the same um, clout and height, and they were not like Yahweh. They were different, they were lesser, but they were gods nonetheless in their world view. So we have to remember that. And that's something that is not talked about. Usually, when we hear the Old Testament talked about, it's total monotheism, but it's not. They worshiped one God, but they definitely had beliefs in other gods. However, Yahweh or Elohim or El Elyon, the Most High God, different traditions. That's a whole thing that we can get into at some point, the different traditions that are laid over the text, and how we got the Elohim tradition and the Yahweh tradition, how they merged those together. But the Old Testament does portray Yahweh as the only God. He alone has the sole authority over everything. Another distinction to make is that the council, like I said, it's not made up of gods like Yahweh. These are definitely lesser deities, way lesser. Not just like a step down in what we see in the ancient Near East culture. It's like you have Yahweh and there's none like him. Everything else is way below him. So that is what is a little bit different in the divine council in ancient Israel. So we're going to examine some scriptural evidence here and talk about what this divine council looked like in the Old Testament. And the first places we're going to go is Psalm 29, Psalm 82, and Psalm 89. When we look at Psalm 29, verse 1, let me read it here. It says, "Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of God, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength." Then Psalm 82, 1 in verse 6 says, "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment." Verse 6, "I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High." And then Psalm 89, 5 says, "Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones." So Psalm 82 and 89 mentions the divine assembly or the council. And in Psalm 82, Yahweh is pictured as taking his place, his seat, and calling the session into order, almost like a courtroom scene. And with the members of the divine assembly around him. And there are other phrases that also solidify that this is verses that are talking about the divine council. And one of those phrases is where it says the sons of God. And so the Hebrew phrase has parallel in Ugaritic text, the Ugaritic phrase sons of El. And here in the Hebrew, we have sons of Elohim. In this phrase, sons of El, in the Ugaritic, was used to describe members of the divine council in all of the Ugaritic stories. So you had other phrases in Ugaritic. You had like the assembly of El, the council of El, the sons of El. All of this was referring to divine council imagery. So El was definitely one of the higher ranked gods, whose name, like I said, was taken and applied to Yahweh in a polemical statement to show that Yahweh is the one true El. In the Hebrew Bible, this phrase, sons of God, sons of Elohim, sons of El, both are used, refers to heavenly beings who are part of the divine council. Other than the Psalm passages, we'll look at them here in a little bit. We see that it's going to appear in Genesis 6 when the sons of God notice the daughters of men and go into them, and the Nephilim are born. Job chapter 1 is one that we're going to look at about the sons of God gathering in a council. In other places, Deuteronomy 32, we'll look at that one as well. And it's all used to talk about these spiritual beings. So therefore, what we see is that the divine assembly, in the phrase sons of God, they point to some sort of divine council in Hebrew thought. And this phrase Elohim, um, this phrase is a very broad term. It is like almost like a place of resonance term, almost like you had the divine realm, and then everything in the divine realm could be an Elohim. Now, these specific Elohims are set apart from other ones because they are specifically sons of the great Elohim. And that's what sets them apart. They are part of the special divine council here. We also see the phrase holy ones in Psalm 89, the assembly of the holy ones. And this phrase holy ones is not talking about humans, but spiritual beings. And the phrase is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to refer to divine beings. Deuteronomy 33 talks about this. Job chapter 5, verse 1 talks about this. And Zechariah 14 talks about this. And Daniel chapter 4, verse 17 also talks about these holy ones. And we will look at some of those chapters later on in the series as well. But what we see from the Psalms is very, very clear. Yahweh taking his seat among the sons of God. We've got this divine council imagery, and these members of the divine council were very powerful spiritual beings, not as powerful as Yahweh, but their goal and their function was that they are to govern and to keep order and carry out the plans of the universe. Now, when we turn to the book of Job, in Job 1, verse 6, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan, or the adversary, or the accuser, also came among them." This is a verse we're going to go back to when we get into this part of the series where we're going to take a deep dive into the theological development of Satan from just a accusatory role on the divine council like he is here, all the way to the main protagonist in Christian theology. But let's get back to the sons of God part here. So the heavenly scene in the book of Job portrays God calling together a divine council to give basically a report on what is going on. And the adversary, the accuser, or the Satan is among those who report to the divine council, which strongly insists that this Satan, this accuser, had this role among the council as the tester. And so the indication here is that these beings are all coming before the Lord, giving reports, and decisions are being made. Now, when we look back at the book of Deuteronomy, there is a very interesting verse that has undergone some translation differences, and I'll get into that. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, it says, "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the numbers of the sons of God." Now, some English translations disagree on this verse, and some may say sons of Israel instead of sons of God. And you'll see some of your older translations will have sons of Israel and not sons of God. I'm not going to get into a big text critical thing. That'll be for other shows, but just a little bit here. The reason there's that difference is the Masoretic text, which was the majority text that was used until the Dead Sea Scrolls. It read sons of Israel. Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed in early 1940s, This part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was way older than the Masoretic text, read sons of God. And this portion in the Dead Sea Scrolls matched what the Septuagint said, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It said sons of God. And so before the Dead Sea Scrolls, translators had to pick, well, are we going to go with the Masoretic text or are we going to go with the Septuagint? And a lot of times they would choose the Masoretic text over the Septuagint. In this case, they changed because the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed what the Septuagint said, that this is probably the original uh, text, what it originally said. And so all of your new modern translations will say sons of God. So that's what's going on there. And it makes much more sense when we understand this as the divine counsel. So when we look at this verse, basically what it means is it's referring to the division of the nations that happened when we go back and read some of the ancient mythology in Genesis, when we look at Babel in Genesis 11, and then the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, that upon this division, what happened is God appointed members of the divine council, the sons of God, to rule and govern those nations. And a lot of people, a lot of scholars think that those uh, the Hebrews viewed those as these nations took on these um, divine rulers, and those divine rulers became their gods. And basically, what you have is these lesser beings ruling over the nations, but God, Yahweh, El Elyon, the Most High, He saved Israel for Himself. And what has happened here is these sons of God were supposed to rule. But then when we look at Psalm 82, we see that they didn't rule well and they were cast down from their positions. We'll get more into Psalm 82 in Genesis chapter 6 as we go on with these next few videos, and we look at the Watchers, fallen angels. What, are there any biblical falls? Does it mention any fallen angels? So we'll get into Genesis 6 and Psalm 82 when that topic comes up. But basically, they were supposed to govern well according to this verse. And then we see, according to Psalm 82, they did not judge and govern well, and they were sentenced to some form of judgment in Psalm 82. Now, I do want to explain this because before we get into our last text about the divine counsel, as we go through some of these stories, you're going to see that it's going to leave a lot of open-ended questions about things and what happened. And what we have to understand here, when the way that the Hebrews did things when they were compiling this and putting the Old Testament in their final form, because there's going to be some open-ended questions about the sons of God and which was which and which rebelled, which didn't. And there may look at sometimes some conflicting data. And we have to understand that what they did is you had different traditions um, in Israel as they were beginning as a nation, and then once they formed as a nation. So a lot of times, what the people making the final decisions in the Old Testament, a lot of times they would just include a lot of these different traditions in the text. And you see that, for example, with David and Goliath's story in Samuel. We have David kills Goliath, and we have another story in Second Samuel. It's supposedly Elkanah that kills Goliath, and then you have the Book of Chronicles, who tries to smooth this over and tries to make sense out of the two conflicting stories. And you also see this in other places as well. But this is just to kind of let you know that when we get into looking at the sons of God, you may see a little bit of this, and they didn't feel the need to add to the stories or explain um, any any seeming things that didn't quite mesh together. That's just the way that they did it. And for us with a Western mind that wants to make everything fit neatly together, sometimes it can drive us crazy. But let's look at one more passage of scripture that kind of talks about the role of the divine council, and that is in First Kings chapter 22. Let me get there. So I'm going to read this. It's about a paragraph. And here, what's going on is you have the prophet Micaiah is prophesying, and he is predicting failure and over Ahab and everything that he's got going on. And he has this vision. And it starts off in verse 19. It says, "Then Micaiah said, 'Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on the throne with all of the host of heaven standing beside him to the right and to the left of him. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab so that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?' Then one said one thing and another said another." So you've got some back and forth talking here among this heavenly host gathered around Yahweh's throne. Um, one said one thing, one said another, until a certain spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, "I will entice him." "How?" the Lord asked him. He replied, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets." Then the Lord said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do it." So again, another more detailed example of the divine council coming together and making deliberation about something, a decision being made, and Yahweh giving the okay for the spirit to go out and perform something which has to do with the pushing forward and what's going to take place in history. Um, so as seen in Deuteronomy, as seen in Psalms, the roles of these divine beings is to govern. Um, we see this too hinted at in Daniel chapter 10, where Michael is called, the archangel Michael is called the prince or the ruler, and he engages with in a battle with the prince and the ruler of Persia. From the book of Job, we see that their responsibility was to gather before Yahweh and give report. Um, but in First Kings 22, we actually get almost a little more detail. We see them. It's mentioned that one said this, one said that, so they're deliberating, and then a spirit steps up and says, "Hey, I've got an idea." Yahweh's like, "Let's hear it," and he says, "Hey, I'm gonna go out and entice him and make him go to the mount. I'll go in the mouth of the prophets, prophesy lies, get Ahab to believe it, and then we'll do it that way." And so God gives this spirit the okay to do that. So the roles and concerns of the divine council is both the moral and the legal decisions of what goes on in the cosmos to shape human history. Um, I think another thing worth mentioning, and we'll wrap it up here, is that within the structure of the divine council, when you look at Ugaritic portrayals, right? I said you've got usually one or two, sometimes seven gods in Ugarit, Mesopotamia. You've got like El and his wife, and they are presented as inhabiting the top tier. And then under them in the second tier, you have the royal family, the sons of El, one particular one being Baal. Baal was actually sometimes a co-ruler, but he was on the second tier and served as a co-regent to El. And then on the third tier, you had craftsman deities, and then the fourth tier, you had messengers. And the ancient Israelites seem to kind of adopt more of a three-tier methodology in how they viewed the divine council. So on the top tier, you had Yahweh. The second tier, you had the sons of God and the ruling, the ones that ruled. And then under that, you had all of the messenger angels. And this is usually what we mostly see referred to a lot of times in the New Testament. And this is what we think of when we think of angels. It is these messenger angels. Um, and this divine council imagery, it also helps us understand certain passages in Genesis 1, where God says, "Let us make man in our own image." This is not a divine plural, it is a reference to the divine council. Also in Isaiah 6, when you have the throne room vision and God is looking for somebody and he says, "Who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Here am I." So scholars now across the board understand this to be divine council type of imagery because of what we see with this reference to the sons of God. So basically, what you have are these high-ranking beings that are in the ancient Israelite view under Yahweh, which are supposed to govern well, but they don't, and they are in control of different nations and carrying out big things in human history. And so this gives us a glimpse into their worldview in how they saw that different things influence history. And so this is really something cool that you can play around with in your writing. I've used several instances of members of the divine council in some of my writings, planning and doing certain things, especially in some of my tetramet stuff that is forthcoming. There are different members of the divine council. They're different watchers, and we'll get into what the watchers are as well later on in this series. But that was the idea of the divine council, and we need to establish that because several things that we're going to talk about moving forward is all going to springboard off of our understanding of this concept of the divine council in the Old Testament. So I will be back Tuesday night doing behind the screens, and we are going to be looking at the movie The Omen and breaking it down a little bit and getting into the history of the Antichrist. And we're going to look and see that the church has not always agreed that there is a literal Antichrist, despite what is portrayed in popular media. That is not an agreed upon thing in Christianity. And there have been tons of people from early on with the church fathers all the way up to today that disagree with this interpretation of there being a literal Antichrist. So we're going to look at that in tandem with breaking down the Omen on Tuesday night. So hope to see you there.